though even the first one made some accusation, but he was somewhat sympathetic. And what about Job's wife? Yeah, first God got. She takes a lot of criticism, but one of you, I don't remember which one it was, made a very good point. The things that Job went through, she's encountered them too. That was a good point. She's suffering too, and a lot of times we don't take that into consideration. But today we're going to be looking at his third friend, Zophar's speech, and he's not very kind. He starts out in Job chapter 11, first 6 verses. He starts out making accusations. And notice what he says. Then answers Zophar, the Edomites, and said, should not the multitude of words be answered? And should a man's form of talk be justified? Should thy lies make men hold their peace? And when thou mockest, shall no man make thee ashamed? For thou hast said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in thine eyes. But, oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee, and that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. Know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine own iniquity deserves. So, in the first 6 verses, he is basically rebuking Job. Now, he begins his question, his answer in there says, should not the multitude of the words be answered? And shouldn't you be justified? What does he mean by that? You ought to have an answer. You ought to be able to find out what's going on. That's exactly what he's saying. That's exactly right. You're saying you're pure, you're saying everything's okay, but what would God say? And that's exactly right. What would God say? Now, so perhaps he means it kind of in this context, Job, you're not as good as you think you are. You're sold on yourself somewhat, but you're not as good as you think you are. What would God say? And so he's kind of coming up with that some type of rebuke like that. And then the next few verses, he begins to talking about the majesty of God and how great God is. And so certainly whenever we consider what he says in the first 6 verses compared to what he says in the next 5 verses, and he says, canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? It is as high as heaven, what can thou do? Deeper than hell, what can thou know us? The measure thereof is longer than the earth and broader than the sea. If he cut off and shut up or gather together, then who can hinder him? So he's talking about God's power, the majesty of God, God's power. You have no control over God, and obviously shouldn't. But so he's going into that concept there about look who you are as opposed to who God is. God is greater. God is in control. And we can't control, God. And so that's kind of where he's going in the verses 7 through 12. And then in verse 12 it says, for vain man would be wise, though man born like a wild donkey colt. So he's pretty well laying it out here to Job. You're not as good as you think you are. But then the next few verses, he begins to talk about the penitent heart. In verse 13, he says, if thou prepare thy heart and stretch out thine hands toward him, if iniquity be in thine hand, put it far away, and let not the wickedness dwell in thy tabernacles. So as he begins these next few verses, what is he telling Job? What is he implying? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And Job, you need to do some self-examination here. You know, you need to figure out what you've done and prepare your heart. Have that penitent heart. Isn't that usually the case? Generally, that's the case. And that's a good point. How easy it is for people in general, not just in the case here, but people in general, how easy it is to look at someone else and see their faults, but we fail to recognize our own. Don't see our own. And that's pretty much a common practice among people. And, you know, just because, look at you, what you've done, I don't do that. But what have you done? One person is no better than the next person. And we all have our pluses, we all have our faults. And so, like Trish said, look in the mirror. Look at your own self. So he's making these somewhat accusations against Job here. And then in verse 15 it says, for then shalt thou lift up thy face without spot, yea, thou shalt be steadfast and shalt not fear. Because thou shalt forget thy misery and remember it as waters that pass away. And so, in these next few verses here, through the rest of this chapter, that's pretty much what he's telling Job is, Job, examine yourself, have that penitent heart, and make whatever amends you need to make. So he's not being very considerate of Job at all. He's pretty much making an accusation. Job, you've whatever it may be, you need to examine yourself. And so he's not showing no compassion here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we would be well, as a lesson here for us as well, that when people are in difficult circumstances, and of course that can vary, of course. When people are in these difficult challenges, whatever they may be, rather than point fingers and make accusations, let's make sure we know what's going on, and instead of make accusation, try to help the person. Help them overcome whatever the issue may be. And so, but you don't necessarily see that here to a degree. He's making these accusations, but he's saying, no, Job, you need to get your heart right. So that's where he's at with this.
If they were actually good friends, they would know Job.
That's right.
It wasn't in his character to do things like you're saying you probably did.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And we look at people that we know, and people sometimes are accused of things. And you may hear the statement made, it might be a parent, whoever makes that statement, well, he or she wouldn't do that. If you know the person, you know their character. But there's also situations where people do things that you wouldn't expect, and you get surprised by what it is they're guilty of. So he's somewhat sympathetic in the respect that, Job, you need to examine yourself and you need to make your heart right with God. That's about as sympathetic as he is, but he's made these accusations. But then, Job, chapters 12 through 14, Job begins to give his response to it. And in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, notice what Job says. And Job answered and said, "No doubt, but you are the people, and wisdom shall die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you, yea, who knows not such things as these." Now, I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, my understanding is as good as yours, and you're no better than I am. I'm not inferior to you. You're no better than I am. And that's a good statement. Certainly, he was no better than Job. And he's expressing his thoughts, his opinion. Job is responding. And in a definitive way, basically it could be saying, well, who are you to judge me? Now, look at yourself. Now, who are you? No, you're no better than me. And is that not true in life? One person is no better than the next. We may not do the same things, but we all have our shortcomings. And we all have our positive points. And so what he's saying is certainly very, very accurate. And but in verses 4 through 12, notice who Job says is responsible for this. He says, "I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he answered him. The just, upright man is laughed to scorn. He that is ready to sit with his feet is as a lamp despised in the thought of him that is at ease." And he goes on, and throughout I won't read all these verses necessarily, but it goes on through verse 12. Who is he blaming? Who does he say is responsible for all this? God. He's saying God is the one that's responsible for this. And, and when we look at it, I'm going to find where I was at here. The verse 6, "The tabernacles of robbers prosper, and they that provoke God are secure, and to whose hand God bringeth abundantly." These people, those who, provoke God, the robbers and so they're secure and they prosper. So in these next few verses, he's in essence saying that God is the one who is responsible for all that's going on. Now,
Mary, what sin came into the world? Things happen to good people. It's not that God, if God did that to everybody who sinned, nobody would be surviving.
that's exactly right.
Just because you have bad things happen to you doesn't mean that you're a horribly sinful person.
That's exactly right. And let me ask this question this way. What he's implying in these verses is that God is responsible for all that has taken place. Is that a correct statement?
Safety about things to happen in his natural world.
Okay.
He can have an influence on it. Certainly the problem with God is evident in a lot of things, but
Why do you suppose Job would be saying God's responsible for this?
God created the world.
One day he thought he was living a perfect life before him.
Okay, what you say, Bill?
In the wisdom of God, this is the plan for his life.
Okay, good points. Now, certainly, bad things happen to good people, and we can't always control that. And since sin entered the world, you've had these situations, and will continue to have these situations. But now God did allow Satan to tempt Job. But, Job's reacting to what took place. But no, God does not tempt man. And Job's, he's somewhat confused here. Now, all this is happening, and I really don't deserve it. Don't know how this came about. So he's, to some degree, saying, okay, God's responsible for this. And certainly God knew and knows what's going on. So he is somewhat, saying, well, this comes down to God. God allowed this. And they did allow him to be tempted. Well, verses 13 through 25, he recognizes and confirms God's power. And all these different verses is emphasizing that point. Again, we won't read all of them for the sake of time. So in verse 13, with him is wisdom and strength. He hath counsel and understanding. Talking about God. Behold, he breaketh down, and it cannot be built up again. He shutteth up a man, and there can be no opening. Behold, he withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. Also he sends them out, and they overturn the earth. So he goes on throughout the rest of this chapter, talking about God's strength and God's power. And so he's recognizing who God is, how powerful God is. And so he knows that. He recognizes that. And he's acknowledging that. And I think that's very significant, very important, that he does recognize, that God's in control.
That sounds like us. That's why we can't get too good. The Bible says seek daily. But right here, God using him, letting him know that he's still there. He's not using him. No matter how good he is. God doing this to get his attention to make sure he recognizes him.
Do we sometimes, perhaps, become so overconfident in ourselves that we leave God out of the equation? It happens a lot, don't it? And we need to be careful of that. That whatever abilities we have, God is the one who has given them to us.
And that's why he allowed Satan to do this.
That's exactly right.
Satan is doing these things to him.
Satan is doing them, and
And he's really teaching Satan a lesson. That Job is my child, and he won't leave him. He won't deny him.
And it's interesting, along those same lines, that as these things have unfolded, Job remains faithful to God. He's confused. No. As we would be, and certainly none of us have lost everything literally to the extent that Job has, but he doesn't blame God. He knows that God's in control, God's responsible, but there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this. And so, he is somewhat confused here.
Well, it doesn't help that his friends, quote friends, are standing on the sideline saying, what did you do? You must have done something
Yeah.
to get this disfavor.
And you think about that, that's a good point. You think about that, you may know that you're right about whatever it may be. But if you're people who are close to you, friends, relatives, whoever, these individuals keep suggesting, well, you've had to do something. It could make you begin to question yourself. Maybe I did, and think back, okay, what did I do to cause this? And so he's facing these challenges. Again, with friends like this, who needs enemies? And as an old saying that we've heard many, many times over. But that's a lot to that here. But then he gets into chapter 13. Notice what he's willing to do. In chapter 13, lo, mine eye hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard and understand it. What you know, the same do I know also. I am not inferior to you. So he says that no, I'm not inferior. And then in verse 3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. But you are forgers of lies. You're all physicians of no value. Oh, that you would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. Hear now my reasoning, and hearken to the pleadings of my lips. Now, verse 7, will you speak wickedly for God and talk deceitfully for him? Will you accept his person? Will you continue for God? So, what does Job want in chapter 13? Mm-hmm.
Initially.
Yeah. And notice what he said. In verse 3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God.
ESV has desire to argue my case.
That's right. Desire to argue my case. I want to be heard. Let me explain my side of this. Argue my case. He's not accusing God. He said, I want God to hear my side of it. And can we understand to some degree where he's coming from with this? Yeah. Now all this is happening. Certainly, you've got to have a certain amount of frustration here, and he does. So he says, I'd like to have a conversation with God about this. I want him to hear my side of this. Well, God already knows his side. And God knows the outcome. But he wants to be heard. He wants to reason with God and wants God to hear what he has to say. But he comes down to verses 20 through 28, and when he gets down there, notice the things that he says. Only do not two things unto me, then will I not hide myself from you. Withdraw thine hand from me, and let not thy dread make me afraid. Then call thou, and I will answer, or let me speak, and answer thou me. So, what are the two things that he's requesting here? Withdraw your hand far from me, and let not the dread make me be afraid. All right, so make it so that I'm not afraid. And then give me an answer. Verse 22. How many are mine iniquities and sins? Make me to know my transgressions and my sin. Now, what have I done? Tell me. Let's have this conversation. Tell me what I've done wrong. Have you ever done that? You've been in trouble for something and tell me what I've done. Perhaps perhaps we have. He said, so tell me what I've done. And then, wherefore you hide thy face, and hide thy face, and holdest me for thine enemy? Wilt thou break a leaf driven to and fro, and wilt thou pursue thy dry stubble? For what writest bitter things against me, and maketh me to possess the iniquities of my youth? Thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly upon all my paths. Thou settest a print upon the heels of my feet, and he as a rotten thing consumeth as a garment that is moth. So, in these 8 verses, give me an answer. What have I done? And we've noticed in the previous chapters that that's a question he would ask, and he wasn't given an answer. But God certainly knew the righteousness of Job, and certainly God recognized, and obviously, that Job is being challenged and being tested by Satan. But God knows the outcome. He knows how he's going to deal with it. And so, he recognizes that. So, Job is somewhat confused. He wanted that meeting with God. But then he gets into chapter 14, and notice what he says. And this is probably one of the most famous verses from the book of Job. Man that is born of a woman is of a few days and full of trouble. Now, we've heard that verse many times, and we certainly understand that. Life is not always easy. We have challenges. We have things going on. Many of the things are a result of our own actions, but not all of them are. It might be a result of someone else's actions. It might be a result of events of nature. But we know the brevity of life, and we know the struggles that we all encounter from time to time. There can be any number of things there. So he's recognizing that. He says, he cometh forth like a flower and is cut down, and flees also as a shadow, and continueth not. The brevity. Here for a little while and gone. James 4 tells us that. Here for a little while and gone. And dost thou open thine eyes upon such a one, and bringest me into judgment with thee? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. So, he begins, talking about the brevity of life. There's the troubles that we encounter. Then he gets down to verse 7. For there is hope of a tree, if it be cut down, that it will sprout again, and that the tender branch thereof will not cease. So, beginning at verse 7 through 22, he's questioning about life itself. Is there hope for an individual? Have you ever maybe had a little tree or something in your backyard and wanted it out of the way, and you cut that little tree down, and you're out there cutting your grass, you notice there's a sprout coming up from it. It's beginning to prosper, He's using that illustration here. What hope do we have? What hope is there for mankind? So that's where he's going with these. And then verses 13 through 17. Oh, that thou would hide me in the grave, and that thou would keep me secret until thy wrath is past, that thou would appoint me a set time and remember me. If a man, verse 14, if a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come. Then shalt call, and I will answer thee. Thou wilt have a desire to the work of thine hands. For now thou numberest my steps. Dost thou not watch over my sins? My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou sewest up my iniquities. So, in verses 13 through 17, he's saying, there must be some hope for man. We're going through all this. Everything's happening the way it is. To be sure, there's some hope somewhere along the way. So that's the challenge that he's put forth, and where's the hope? Do people not sometimes get to that point where they question, is there any hope? What else can I do? That type of thing. But he finishes this chapter out in the last 4 verses. He says, and surely the mountain falleth, cometh to naught, and the rock is removed out of its place. The waters wear the stones. Thou washest away the things which grow out of the dust of the earth, and thou destroyest the hope of man. So verse 19, he says, these events occur, but he sums it up in verse 19, thou destroyest the hope of man. Thou prevailest forever against him, and he passeth. Thou changest his countenance and sends them away. His sons come to honor, and he does not know it. And they are brought low, but he perceiveth is not of them. But his flesh upon him shall have pain, and his soul within him shall mourn. So the previous verses, there's got to be sure there's hope for man. But he kind of sums it up by saying, where is that hope? I don't see the hope. What hope do we have? Again, he doesn't understand everything that's going on. Does he realize that God has allowed Satan to tempt him? He sees what's happening. But does he know God is the one who allowed it? Thought probably never crossed his mind in that respect. But he knows these things are taking place. So, that's a brief survey of chapters 11 through 14. Again, we're not trying to go verse by verse. We're looking at the challenges that Job faces and how he deals with them. So, that's a brief survey of these here 4 verses, and we'll move on next week with the next few. Appreciate the discussion and comment as always.